his job was to take care of his flock. He was the shepherd of the flock in Chicago.
The fact that my health is uncertain, but it's a question of being able to spend your entire energy on what is my responsibility as Archbishop of Chicago. We have to call people to an encounter with Christ. That's what evangelizing is. It's simple. It means you invite people to know Jesus Christ. And then they want to live like him, and so we have discipleship. So it's very important that you be the instruments that God uses to create this encounter between Jesus and the people that he died for and that he loves.
Hello, welcome to our celebration of the life of Cardinal George. I'm Dawn Fitzpatrick, and I manage the Chastity Education Initiative for the Archdiocese of Chicago. Cardinal George founded the Chastity Education Initiative in 2003 as a way to provide high-quality, medically informed, life-changing programs and materials to young people in the Catholic schools, parishes, and religious education programs of the Archdiocese of Chicago. His hope was to instill in teens, young adults, and families the beautiful virtue of chastity and a profound respect for human life. Thanks to the continued support of the Cardinal's legacy, this ministry continues to grow in its successes to counter the lies that are proliferated in our current society. The Chastity Education Initiative provides things like dynamic speakers for teens and adults, faithful curricula for our Catholic schools and parish faith formation programs like Theology of the Body for Teens and the Ruah Woods Rooted program, high quality materials for Catholic schools, universities, Newman centers, parishes, and more. We also provide a youth rally in conjunction with the March for Life Chicago, training to enable archdiocesan employees, including school teachers and catechists and other interested adults, to teach Pope St. John Paul II's theology of the body. Our flagship emergent experience, Echo Chicago, where teens and young adults get to live theology of the body for a week, is also a major thing that we do with the Chastity Education Initiative. Some of the fruits of our Chastity Education Initiative include young adults who've discerned to attend seminary or pursue a religious life. What a blessing. Young adults who have experienced a mission opportunity, some who've even been asked to volunteer in our office or to teach theology of the body in our Catholic schools. Isn't that great? And first and foremost, we've reached thousands and thousands of young people and families in the Chicago area with our life-changing message that is John Paul II's theology of the body. And as a result, those who hear the message understand that God has a life plan for us, a vocation that is to be lived for the rest of our life. Our event tonight will benefit the Chastity Education Initiative. It was Cardinal George's wishes that set up the CEI to be funded by donors like you. If at any time this evening you feel called to support us, please click the link to donate in the description section of this video, as well as in the chat. For each person who donates $50 or more tonight, we'll send you a DVD copy of the movie Glorious Lives. Special thanks to Mike Stark, executive producer of this documentary, for giving us full access to this incredible film. And thank you also to our host committee, who you saw listed on the screen just a few minutes ago. Our plans for this evening, and I really can't wait for you to do this, is to watch Glorious Lives, followed by a riveting panel discussion with some of Cardinal George's most devoted team. Leading our evening is our moderator and my friend, Damon Owens. Damon Owens, international speaker and evangelist, is executive director of Joyful Ever After, the first executive director of Theology of the Body Institute and chairman of the 2016 International Theology of the Body Congress. Damon founded Joyful Ever After as a nonprofit ministry dedicated to encouraging and educating couples to understand and live marriage and family life together with joy through John Paul II's theology of the body. host of the 2020 Catholic Marriage Summit, presenter at the 2019 Catholic Family Life Symposium, 2017 USCCB Convocation of Catholic Leaders, and 2015 World Meeting of Families, Damon keeps a full international speaking schedule at conferences, seminars, universities, high schools, seminaries, parishes, all on the good news of marriage, sexuality, theology of the body, theology of the family, adoption, and NFP. Phew. He's just got an enormous amount of things to tell you about. In 2018, Pope Francis honored Damon with his Benemerenti Papal Medal. So he received the Benemerenti Papal Medal from Pope Francis in recognition for his work in support of marriage and family. Damon lives outside Philadelphia with his wife Melanie and their 8 children. You're in great hands with Damon tonight. So here's Damon. I know he's trying to join us.
Yeah, you have dead air.
Okay. His mic and video aren't on. There we go.
Cheers.
Can you hear me? Dawn, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Oh, good. I'm so sorry for that. This is definitely one of those moments where no matter how much you practice, how much tech you put in, there's always something that can go. We're not going to let it stop us at all. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this evening. It really is a privilege for me. You and I have been friends for quite a while, and the Chastity Education Initiative has not only been on my heart and my radar since the days of the Theology of the Body Institute, but in the years that I've had the privilege of coming out to speak at the schools as one of those speakers that nights like tonight make possible. And I've also enjoyed greatly the times where we've been live in the flesh, as it were, with the fundraisers and the evenings. And we're all making do, even with the great technology. And when it's great, it's great. When it's not, it's not. But we're making do here, in that there are so many people that have supported the Chastity Education Initiative over the years. I've met them personally. I've had a chance, as I said, on the other end, to be able to visit some of these schools and these students and be a part of this. So it really is a joy when I say that, for me to be with you and be with everyone who's watching tonight, to either continue your support for this great work or join us for the first time and love opportunity, not only with, as Dawn mentioned, a fantastic film, a wonderful film that I've had a chance to watch, and you get the abridged version and you get the full version with the donation, as Dawn mentioned, but such a great work from Mike Stark. So as Dawn mentioned, our plan for the night is to watch for the next about 45-50 minutes an abridged version of the life of Cardinal George, and then come back. And please be sure to stick around for our panel discussion with just some beautiful people who, not only in their own right, have had great contact and stories and encounters with Cardinal George, but the beautiful thread that connects this evening with the Chastity Education Initiative and this honoring of Cardinal George is just how legacy is built. Yeah. That a heart, that alive, to be engaged in God's work in the heart, has a way of touching people. And legacy is what endures in the years after those who listen really to the heart and the word of God. So without any further ado, because Dawn, you know I could talk for a while, we're going to move to our film and be back with you after the film for just a fantastic panel, and we'll be able to take your questions and dive a little deeper into the connections of the Chastity Education Initiative and the legacy of Cardinal George. Let's take a look at the film.
Hello, I'm Mike Stark. It's my honor to bring you the life story of Francis Cardinal George, priest, missionary, friend, and neighbor.
I'm Margaret CAINE. I'm also Cardinal Francis George's sister, his only sister.
I'm here with Margaret CAINE, and it's an honor to be here, Margaret. Tell me a little bit about your folks, your mom and dad, and how it was growing up with them and in the house.
They were very good parents. I was very fortunate to be one of their children. My mother was a very religious woman. She was also very talented. She played the piano. She had a certificate to teach music. He was 4 years old when we moved into our house in St. Pascal's Parish. We just did a lot of things. We played games, board games, Monopoly. He played that with his cousins too. Well, he rode his bike. We played baseball on the street with the large ball at that time. We did a lot of things. He was a very good brother. Of course, I was his older sister. Every winter, they had the Cinnamon Bear on the radio, and we would come in after school, and we'd do our homework, and then we'd listen to the Cinnamon Bear before supper.
This is the story of the Cinnamon Bear and his very marvelous adventures with Judy and Jimmy Barton. But we can't very well meet the Cinnamon Bear until we meet Judy and Jimmy. They are twins, and they live in a big, old-fashioned house.
Well, he was so talented in music. My mother was certified in music, and she taught him the piano. And then after that, she gave him to another teacher to go on with him. And he had a lovely voice, a lovely soprano voice. And he went down to the Paulist choir, Father O'Malley, and he interviewed with him. And he was accepted into the Paulist choir. Had Mass every Sunday down at Old St. Mary's Church. So we would go down there for Mass sometimes just to hear him. And that was lovely.
When he was 13 years old, he wanted to get into the seminary in Chicago, and he became sick. He got polio, and I know he was very diligent in pursuing the priesthood. When did you first notice that he had an affinity for the priesthood, and what was his attitude about becoming a priest?
It was around the time that he made his first communion that he started. We had altars in the bedroom. We had candles and we had flowers, and we even had a little fire at one time. My mother said we can't light the candles to have the fake mass. And he did a lot of things over at church. He was with Monsignor Heimsath many, many times. My mother would wonder where he was and call over there, and there's where he was helping Monsignor Heimsath with something at the church. And his life was centered after a while, really, on the church. Everybody just kind of understood that he was going to go to the priesthood.
This 13-year-old kid is stricken with polio, which almost killed him and left him severely disabled. Running around and bike riding and painting and piano playing were permanently behind him. It would have been very easy for this young man basically to give up, to withdraw. He did anything but. Pressed forward with enormous determination. And the deepest desire of his heart when he was that age was to be a priest.
Cardinal George, obviously, when he was young, was stricken with polio, and that was a major factor in, obviously, his religious education and what he was going through as he was striving to become a holy man. What have you found from your research were some of the struggles that he faced as he was growing up, trying to accomplish his goal of becoming a priest in the face of the fact that certain people didn't necessarily think he could make it?
Yeah. Well, you know, he was 13 years old. He had applied to Quigley High School Preparatory Seminary in Chicago before the polio came, and he, from what I understand, was accepted. But then when the polio hit, he was told, well, you might not be able to come here. They eventually said, yeah, you could probably come here to school, but we really don't think you could navigate the buses. I think it was something like 2 or 3 bus transfers to get down there from where he was living. And they also told him, you may come here, perhaps, but we'll never ordain you a priest. In his own words, which I found him quoted in part of my research, he said, forget about them. I'm going to become a priest anyway.
Because of the polio, they wouldn't accept him. They didn't know if he could ever say Mass. They didn't know anything. It was all new to them. So the Oblates of Mary Immaculate came in. Their vocational director came into the living room. I was there when this happened, and said to him, if you can walk across that floor, you can become an oblate. And of course he walked across the floor. He didn't have any problem with that at all. So that's how he became an oblate.
But then he moves down to southern Illinois, to Belleville, right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. And you imagine a young boy, 13 years of age, on crutches with a limp. He's moving away from home. He has this great desire to serve God and his church as a priest, and he's not going to let anything stand in his way. Now, when he's moving down there, he's giving up all the comforts of life, right? He's giving up complete and total comfort. And so he's moving into this high school, it's a boarding school, and he's completely dependent on the help of others. Not only that, but he couldn't quite fit in with the other guys. He couldn't go out necessarily and play the sports that they could play in their kind of recess, or whatever you'd call it, their activity time. What would he do? He would stay indoors. He would talk to the teachers. He would read books. He was also an artist. And during that time, he served as an art editor for the school kind of magazine that they published at St. Henry's in Belleville. But you hear stories about him just kind of looking out the window at the other guys while they're playing football. And you think of how is this impacting him just on a day-to-day level? He had to have a priest actually come and massage his legs as a boy because of the polio and the fallout from that disease. He really had to open himself up and shed off any kind of pride he had, any kind of ambition that he had. He just wanted to serve the Lord. And that's what redemptive suffering is all about. Redemptive suffering, as St. John Paul II put it, is a gift that God gives us to shed ourselves, to be humble, to open ourselves up to God's will, to follow Christ completely all the way to the cross. Francis George was introduced to that as a young boy and it made an immense impact. We talked about the hand of providence in the life of Francis George. If he didn't get polio, who knows what would happen with his life? It was a gift in the end, I think he would say.
Well, they sent him to Ottawa, to St. Paul's University, I think. That was a seminary there. I think he was the only U.S. person in that seminary. The rest of them were all Canadians. They all spoke French. He had to learn French that way. The rector of the seminary decided that all the seminarians should go to their home parishes to be ordained, to let the people see what an ordination was. And that's why he was ordained at St. Paschal's Parish in Chicago. It was December he was ordained. It was 18 below zero in Chicago the morning he was ordained. I know, we walked 2 blocks, 18 below zero, and he had to lay on that cold marble floor.
Father Jeté is his spiritual director at the time. They form a great relationship. He turns into his mentor. And then the Oblates of Mary Immaculate reach a kind of crisis point when their superior general resigns suddenly after he's elected. Father Jeté was the vicar general, which means now he's succeeding up to the point of being superior general. And they need a new vicar general. And that becomes Francis George.
As Vicar General, Father George's horizons were expanded to the whole oblate world. He visited the oblates in all corners of the world. That gave him a very world vision.
The Oblates describe it that Jeté was kind of the introverted, prayerful, thoughtful one, and Francis George was the extroverted one who ended up globe-trotting, going to all the missions of the Oblates throughout the world.
I had a globe, and he would send us letters, and he would explain what he was doing and where he was going, and a little bit about the history of where he was. And I would show the countries on the globe to my children so that they knew where Uncle Francis was.
He spoke French without a problem. He spoke Italian with no problem. He also could speak German. Kind of a side note, when he'd come here to Chicago, he told me he was going to go to Poland, and the problem was, he says, I have to write down what I'm saying because the Polish words I learned on the street of Chicago, I don't dare say in public.
Or especially in church.
Yes.
I met him 12 hours after I'd hoped to meet him when I was waiting at O'Hare for his plane to get in from Portland. Nobody else knew that he was going to be named Archbishop of Chicago. Only the Pope knows that, and he doesn't know it. He doesn't announce it until 4 in the morning Chicago time. At 10 o'clock, I went on the air and said, the next Archbishop of Chicago will be the first homegrown Archbishop this city and Archdiocese has ever known. And then I held my breath for the next 6 hours to make sure I was right. Well, I was right. I really got to know Cardinal George, then Archbishop George, was when I traveled to Portland before his installation as Archbishop in Chicago. And we talked at length. We rode, we toured the city, we had a meal together. And I really found out what made this man tick. The fact was, I knew then, and I know today, that he was the smartest guy in the room.
What's the best assignment you've ever had?
Well, Archbishop of Chicago, of course.
What's the most challenging assignment you've ever had?
Archbishop of Chicago, beyond any doubt.
Last week, I confirmed in the cathedral in Portland. And as my custom, I talked to the young men and women to be confirmed before the ceremony. We went through it, we talked about it a little bit, and then I asked, are there any other questions? One young man put his hand up and he says, "Archbishop, who is going to be Archbishop of Portland?" And I said, "Well, I really don't know, that we should pray for him and keep that intention in your prayers." And he said, "Well, Archbishop, you're going to Chicago. Maybe we could arrange a trade and have Michael Jordan come here." With faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and with the love of God in my heart, I do accept the pastoral care of the people of God in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Church exists where the gifts of Christ are shared. The church is the body of Christ. In the church, every racial and cultural difference must be made public so that everyone can come to know how Christ can be black or white, brown or yellow or red.
What we take with us from this life into the next are simply the relationships. Everything else disappears, but they are eternal.
Not going to Mass on Sunday is gravely sinful. In order to live forever, you have to have an immortal body. In order to have an immortal body, you take the seeds of immortality into your body by receiving the Eucharist every Sunday.
We have to call people to an encounter with Christ. That's what evangelizing is. It's simple. It means you invite people to know Jesus Christ. The important thing is the encounter, the relationship. When they begin to encounter Christ, then they want to know more about him, and we have catechesis. And then they want to live like him, and so we have discipleship. So it's very important that you be the instruments that God uses to create this encounter between Jesus and the people that he died for and that he loves. Everything changes, everything passes. The only thing that is the same yesterday, today, and forever is Jesus Christ in the letter to the Hebrews yesterday, and Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, and his words, his promises. That lasts forever. So maybe in the midst of this terrible crisis, people will begin to realize that you may have a new car today, but it's going to be reclaimed tomorrow. If you go to communion today, that lasts forever. It's very individualistic in our political life. The Church's social teaching doesn't begin with individuals. The Church's social teaching begins with the family. Because first of all, we're in a family before we even know that we're individuals. We're born related. We're somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's brother, somebody's sister. But politics is only so much of life. Society is a lot bigger. And that emphasis on society and on relationship and on communality and protecting the family, that is very different. The great witness of Catholic hospitals is that in them, no one is ever deliberately killed, whether before birth or in old age. The Church, of course, is composed of people who worship God in spirit and in truth in parishes and elsewhere. But because we worship God and love God, therefore we love our neighbor, and so the Church is equally dedicated to the corporal works of mercy. And the government is telling us, no, you're not. You're just your worship. And so this is new in our constitutional history and in the history of the Universal Catholic Church. And we would like simply to say, why don't we practice our faith freely as we have for the last 200 years? Why must our institutions be taken from us? God never permits the killing of an innocent person. That's exactly what abortion is. If you have a constitutional order that gets its legitimacy from its legal protection of everyone, citizen or not, and that's why we had a good legal system, because our legal system, at least in theory, protected everyone. When we took the protection of law away from the unborn, we destroyed our constitutional order. In theory, our legal system protected everyone, including the unborn. If you can solve a personal problem by killing someone,
who's still unborn, you can solve a personal problem by killing someone who is born. And I think that it is absolutely crucial. The bishops don't run this country. I don't run this country, nor do we collectively. The people do. So you're as much responsibility for the future of the country as I am. Wait.
In dealing with the media, I learned that a lot of people just didn't understand him. And I remember one reporter saying to me, I just don't get it. Some people think he's so wonderful and so great, and I just see him on TV and he's grumpy. And I said, well, when you see him on TV, he's usually dealing with a crisis. He doesn't go on TV usually to give a homily. So it's usually either, a church is burning down or a school's closing or there's a problem. And so he's looking stern because it's a serious issue. But when he's out in the parishes and he's seeing the people, which is where he wanted to be the majority of the time, that's what he liked to do the most, you saw a different person. I remember one time he was saying that it was some issue we were talking about, and I didn't agree. And it was the teachings of the church. I said, well, I still don't agree, which was dangerous. And he said, well, I'm not sure I do either. And I said, oh my God, you don't either? And then this is great. And I said, well, then why do you say all these things? It's because it's the teachings of the church. Look, I follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. You follow the teachings if you're a Catholic, or you don't. You can't be a cafeteria Catholic. You have to follow all the teachings. He said, now, if this was the Church of Francis George, it might look a little different. We both burst out laughing. I mean, the whole thing was so funny, but it was so candid, it was so honest. And he made it real clear that you may not agree with everything, but we're not supposed to pick and choose what parts of the church we want to agree with and what we don't, as far as when it comes down to following the teachings.
Someone asked him, this is early on in his time, well, what's your program for the Archdiocese? What's your plan? And he said, my program is to say Mass every morning for the people of the Archdiocese. And of course, I threw off the news person, but I totally get that. Now, he wasn't naive. He did have programs and plans and all that. But what he was trying to get away from was this hyper, pragmatic business way of looking at things. His major job was to be the bishop of the Archdiocese of Chicago. As bishop, the most important thing he could possibly do is pray for the Archdiocese. Everything else was secondary. Everything else came under that heading. And I think that's what he wanted to convey to that newsman. His legacy, he'd probably say, I said Mass every morning for the people of the Archdiocese. John Paul II had asked him in one of their meetings, what are you doing to evangelize the culture? And even though that was a major theme for the Cardinal, he said he didn't quite know what to say to John Paul II. So he turned to me and he said, that's what I'm interested in, is what can we do to evangelize the culture? So then he got me on a path that's led me largely where I am today in terms of my Word on Fire work. Word on Fire, I think, is very much a Cardinal George legacy. I'll claim being the spiritual father of Word on Fire, he's the spiritual grandfather of it, because he brought me into this work, and then I developed Word on Fire as a means to accomplish that work. He was a man of the Mass, so that was like a non-negotiable. Nothing flashy about it, nothing kind of, grand or show-offy, but a simple, pious celebration of the Mass. He had a great devotion to the priesthood. He believed in the priesthood. He didn't like the sort of attenuation of the priesthood that was somewhat in vogue in the years after the council. He wanted to revive it. He was proud of it, and he wanted priests to be proud of their priesthood. And he cared for them with a real pastoral sensitivity. Cardinal George had a great devotion to priests, and I saw this close up. Any priest, anytime, that wanted to see him would see him within, I'd say, a half a day. So he gave standing instructions to Father FLENS, his secretary. Anytime a priest of Chicago wants to see me, you make it happen. And I saw it, again, when I lived there. This, let's say, would be a Saturday afternoon. And maybe for me, it was a little bit of a downtime, not for him. He probably had appointments in the morning, and then in the afternoon, he would see priest after priest after priest. Or he'd see them late at night.
He was very good about making himself available to the seminarians. And at least with the Chicago men, he always gathered with them once a year with a dinner. So we'd have dinner with the second-year men or the fourth-year men. And I know that intimate conversation between the Cardinal and the seminarians helped them become comfortable with him and helped the Cardinal learn more about who they are.
Well, the Liturgical Institute was founded by Cardinal George because he looked out at the church and he saw a problem that people didn't understand how they should interpret liturgical decisions. Partly it came around the study of the nature of translations. And so the Institute, as we have it now, which is a graduate program in sacramental theology and liturgical studies, is founded in his particular insight that the knowledge of God and God's self-revelation is the lens through which you see all things in the study of how God wants to be worshipped.
I admired his thoughts and observations about the evangelization of American culture. I'm an American Catholic historian by training. And of course, when you know the religious history of the United States, the people of the United States are very religious people. Faith, especially Christianity, is taken very seriously in the American culture. Over 95% of our people say they believe in God. Over 70% of our people would worship regularly at a church, those kind of things. There's one side of this apparent contradiction. The other side is we're the most secular. So our culture is not religious, but our people are. And I love to listen to Francis George, who was a philosopher and a theologian by training. I'd love to listen to him speak about this evangelization of American culture. I don't know of anybody who spoke more to that than Francis Cardinal George, and he did it very well.
The books that he's written, some of the other writings that he's made, you've been digging deep into the records, and you've got more to do. But if you could tell us a little bit more about what you found out in your research.
As you know, Cardinal George was a man of the intellect. What he tried to do in his kind of intellectual work started out when he was a young priest, when he went to Tulane University in New Orleans and got a doctorate in American philosophy. As a missionary of Oblate of Mary Immaculate, he really wanted to get a kind of sense of what makes Americans tick. And so American philosophy kind of gave him an understanding of who are these people I want to bring the gospel to here in this country. And then beyond that, he ends up going to Rome and serves as Vicar General with the Oblates, and he travels the world. And he gets a real notion of what makes all cultures tick, right? Firsthand exposure to this. And so he writes a second doctorate on enculturation of the gospel, enculturation in communion. How does the church facilitate relationships between us and God, us and each other, us and the wider creation? He often would say, and this comes up in his first published book, which is The Difference That God Makes. And so relationships are what define us the most. It's really our identity. Well, when he studied American philosophy, he really got a handle on liberalism, and I don't mean that as a political label. I mean that by liberalism, what has defined modernity as a focus on the self, on the ego, that I, number one, am most important. And he says, no, we as Christians follow the pattern of the Trinity. We follow relationship. Others matter more than me. I should see myself through others. And that's really what that first book kind of gets at. What is the difference that God makes? And he starts out at the beginning of the book saying he would walk throughout the chancery in Chicago and start asking his department staffs, if God didn't exist, what would you do differently? And I think that that's something that all of us can ask ourselves. And Cardinal George really kind of leads the way to that. But in many ways, he was very prophetic, too, in what he had to say. He had a real eye in zeroing in on where God is missing in society, and then showing the difference that God can make. And that leads to his second book, which is God in Action, where he really talks about how God is missing from the public square, especially in American democracy. And then we have the third book, the last book, which he was finishing up just days before he died. And that book really kind of illustrates his love for the intellectual tradition of the church. And I think that he wrote that final book kind of as a testimony to his brother bishops. Like, here's what I've learned as a bishop. Here's what our identity should be, looking back on the intellectual tradition of the church and seeing intellectual bishops who brought about a deeper understanding of the faith for their people.
One time I was at the annual meeting of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and he was scheduled to give a talk. This was one of our meetings where it was a little bit more of a reflection, like a retreat. And while the previous speaker was giving his presentation, I'm sitting next to Cardinal George, and he's scribbling on the agenda. He's just kind of writing around the corners of the paper, and I kind of leaned over and I said, "Are you writing your talk?" And he said, "Yeah." And so he went up there, and because of his polio and his bad leg, he didn't stand at the podium like the previous speaker. He just sat. And he never had good eye contact when he was talking because I think he was so much in his head. He was thinking like this. And so he was looking down and just talking in full sentences, full coherent paragraphs. And it looked like he was reading from the text. And I knew he had just little scribblings in front of him, and he's just talking in these beautiful sentences. And so afterwards, the bishops loved it, and I had bishops coming up to me saying, "That was a great speech that the Cardinal gave. Can you get me a copy of the text?" And so I said, "Well, let me see what I can do." So he's coming down from the dais, and I said to him, "Your Eminence, there's the bee there." I said, "Bishops are asking for a copy of your text." He hands me the scrap of paper. He said, "Here." I said, "That's what I was afraid of."
Extrapolate on this.
Yeah.
However, when the chair said, "We recognize Cardinal George," iPads were put down, papers were put down, people stood up, and you could see people make straight their chairs, and their heads were up listening. And because they knew they were going to hear something, something which they didn't consider. The tremendous aspect was Cardinal George was a philosopher. And because he was a philosopher, whenever he spoke on a subject, he not only gave you the analysis that everybody else was giving, or his support for basically one aspect of it or another, but he gave you the seminal reasons why.
As you know, Cardinal George was a man of the intellect. He was a man of immense curiosity, and that curiosity manifested itself in all sorts of ways. He took keen interest in art, and if you walked into an art museum with him, people have told me, he could give you the history of every painting in that museum. If you liked wine, he could tell you everything about a glass of wine without looking at the label. He was a man of immense curiosity, but ultimately, what was he most curious about? The source of all things, God. And he came to know that God very clearly through his studies, through his prayer life, through his witness as a disciple.
The Cardinal was a font of information. I really did, when he came for dinner, want to just set my recorder down. Because as you know, he was so articulate. If he could use 50 words instead of 500 to answer a question, he did. He was just that intelligent to be in his presence. It could have been a homily at a mass, it could have been a speech at an event at Notre Dame University, it could have been dinner in my home. You always learned something from the Cardinal.
When I was living with him, our schedules didn't typically interact. He was busy. I was doing things and going places and so on. But from time to time, they would intersect, and we'd both be at the table in his house. If he didn't have an appointment in the evening, he loved to have his dinner, but then he would stay for 2 hours, 2.5 hours after dinner talking. And what I used to do when I was there is I tried to get him off of business. What he really loved were books and ideas. And so I would say to him something like, hey, you know, I'm reading this book by so-and-so, and I would share a few of the ideas, and then he would get you know, interested. And we talked for a long time. He was a lot of fun too. So those are my favorite memories of him, is sharing ideas, laughing a lot, talking for hours and hours about theology and the culture and the life of the mind.
I would say the most intelligent person I ever met. But he could talk with everyone. When they were remodeling the cathedral rectory, which had hardly been touched since it was built, all the priests had to move out. And there was no room in the apartment house nearby where the other priests went, so I had to live at the Archbishop's residence on North Avenue. And among the people that were there was Father Barron, who's now Bishop Barron. He lived with us a couple days a week. When he was at table, there was a very intellectual conversation, which I did not join in. The two of them talked. Then his sister would come. His sister would come, and what did they talk about? What was important to her? Shopping at the supermarket. Because as a housewife and mother, this was important. So he could talk to everybody about what interests them.
You know, for the complexity of his thinking and for the eloquence of his expression, for the breadth of his reading and study, he was a very simple man.
Cardinal George always felt a special bond with John Paul II because Cardinal George would say, he made me a bishop. He became a bishop under John Paul II as Bishop of Yakima, then as Archbishop of Portland, and then coming here to Chicago. And so he felt that closeness, almost if you want to take that father-son or pastor-associate, well, now as a bishop, your pastor is the Pope. And so he felt that closeness. He also, I think, felt a special bond because he understood his thought. He was trained, Cardinal George was trained in philosophy, and he could read John Paul II's writings and say, I see where he's going here, because he was a philosopher and he could see the philosophy behind it and how John Paul was approaching the topic about which he was writing. So there was a special bond there.
When John Paul died, Francis George was being interviewed by CNN for a documentary they did on his funeral. And Francis George started telling the story of John Paul's body being brought into St. Peter's Basilica after the funeral mass.
We were in, and we were ahead of it, waiting for him to pass by. And so once they slammed those doors, it was utter silence in St. Peter's Basilica. All you could hear was the pallbearers bringing the coffin through. And we were on either side, about 6 feet between us, of the long aisle leading up to the altar, because they had to bring the body down into the crypt where it was to be buried. And there was no music, there was no sound. We just watched him pass for the last time. When cardinals greet the Pope, they always take off the zucchetto, the red skull cap, out of respect. Then you put it back on to talk to him. And quite spontaneously, one by one, as he went by, we each took off our zucchettos. And then they took him down. He was a great man.
Many people think of Francis George as kind of the stoic, tough guy, who really didn't play around very much with people. But he was really a very sensitive and emotional guy deep down. And it came across loud and clear when he was talking about the death of his mentor and friend, St. John Paul II.
At the end of 1999, we had received reports that the city was going to tear down the high-rises where many of the African-American poor were housed on the south side. And there was a decision by the Cardinal and the Chancellor at that time that we should go visit one of these apartments in these high-rises. And it was a sunny day in the spring where we went to the Robert Taylor homes. And we went on one of the higher floors. And the people who had arranged the visit had a particular woman's apartment. I think she had a couple kids at the time. It was a stark place, very, very poor. And she was describing her story to us. Cardinal George, and hearing her story, I never saw him like that before, thereafter, but he was so visibly moved by her and her story. He got up from his chair and he went over to her and he hugged her. Most people don't know Cardinal George as a huggy type, but you could see the sympathy or the empathy that poured out of him towards her. And he asked her what he could possibly do for her situation.
He never said anything about this, but that he was in constant pain with that leg. The only way I know this is his sister Margaret talked about that.
And I saw it. One time I was at the University of Chicago at the Rockefeller Chapel. There was a prayer service. And Cardinal George was presiding, and he was in full regalia. He had mitre, crozier, the whole thing. And he got up to proclaim the gospel, and there was a little step that was very hard to see in the sanctuary. And he went completely tumbling over that step. Mitre, crozier, going in every direction. And I know in the wake of that, he was rather severely injured because the brace, he wouldn't give way. So when he fell, the brace caused a lot of injury. We all went over to him. He said, I'm fine, I'm fine. He got up, went on, and that was it. No further reference to it. He told us the first day he arrived in Chicago, the priest gathering, he said, never feel sorry for yourself. I think we all remembered that. That was his typical Cardinal George. It wasn't sentimental.
He was very generous with his person and his time as the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago. You could see he enjoyed people.
He wanted to reach out to people. Besides his schedule in the office, he was constantly reaching out to people. And he would love to go and celebrate masses in the parishes during the week, not only on weekends, on special occasions.
What was important for him, and it was gathering people around Christ in the church. And whether that was through his talks, whether that was through his celebration of the liturgy, whether it was being present at events, whether here in the Archdiocese of Chicago or nationally or internationally for the church, it was drawing people to Christ in his church. It was consistent with his motto, to Christ be glory in the church. And he always talked about the bishop should be a center of unity, and he wanted his ministry to bring about that unity around Christ.
The fact that my health is uncertain, it isn't just a question of imminent death. I'm not going to be dying, I don't think, in the next few months. But it's a question of being able to spend your entire energy on what is my responsibility as Archbishop of Chicago. One moment you're at the center of everything, and the next moment you're not. Or I have to spend a lot more attention to health problems than I had to before, both because of the cancer and new treatments and danger of infections constantly and some post-polio problems. And this is a full-time job. So I am relieved and grateful that now somebody who can do it full-time will be in charge.
2 questions, Eminence, about emotions. You get what you wanted to be able to retire, the first Archbishop of Chicago to retire. Is that a relief to you? And was his appointment as much of a surprise to you as it apparently was to me?
You know, Jay, the first time we ever talked, you started out asking, how do I feel? And after a half hour of that, I said, Jay, why don't you ask me what I think? And we've been at this ever since.
I don't know how I am physically because I'm in an experimental medical protocol that could go in several directions, and we'll know once they take scans sometime in December, I believe, which way it's going. If this doesn't work, and it might not be working, then they'll have to come up with some other form of treatment. But each time, the options become fewer. I think the Lord, in His goodness, prepares us to meet Him face to face, by stripping away a lot of accoutrements of life, desires, even good desires, so that in the end, there's one thing necessary, that is the love of God.
I remember when the Cardinal announced that he had cancer, and I know that he was suffering, but you never heard about the suffering. He took that suffering on, and you would really see the Cardinal's strength. He suffered in silence.
You know, when he got really sick, he came in and he told me, he said, you know, I think I got about 6 months to a year to live. And so I told him one time, we were talking, and he said, Your Eminence, just in case you should die before me, when you go see God, I thought, will you tell him if he can leave me a little spot so I can open up a barbershop in heaven? And they start to laugh. He says, you know, what are you doing to me? You always crack me up.
I remember towards the end of his life, when his health was very poor, he'd come to the cathedral and he'd heard confessions, because this was part of his mission, working with people. And he considered hearing confessions a very important part of his life as a priest, as a bishop.
I just wanted to visit him as he was getting closer to. We were able to walk together that night, and I felt very clearly how the Holy Spirit was working in his soul.
When he got very bad, he couldn't walk anymore. They had him in a wheelchair, and Father Dan used to, move him around in the house, and I call him up. I says, Your Eminence, I want to come over there and give you a haircut and shave at the residential. And he said, well, you don't have to do that. I says, what I got to do, what I don't have to do is my business. I'll be there Sunday morning. And I did that for about 4 months, 5 months. I just went every Sunday to give hair, trim his hair. He didn't have any hair left toward the end. I just shaved him, and he just enjoyed. And toward the end, it was so bad that one time I was shaving him, and he started to cry. The tears would come down his face, and he couldn't hardly talk. It was on Sunday, and he died on Wednesday morning.
You could see that he was dying, and we waited. And when he did die, we were all together, the priests and the sisters, and we sang the Salve Regina. It was kind of a beautiful death. In my mind, if he didn't go straight to heaven, I don't know who does.
He was wonderful.
Wonderful.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back from that wonderful film for our Chastity Education Initiative
live stream where we are celebrating Cardinal George and themes here that we're going to pick up in this beautiful panel that I'm so honored to moderate. My name is Damon Owens, you heard earlier, Executive Director of Joyful Ever After. And for many years with the Theology of the Body, also just a great admirer of Cardinal George and the work he's done in Chicago, and privileged for many years to work here. But really excited to be with you tonight to talk through not just the movie, but maybe teasing out some of the real beautiful ways that Cardinal George in his heart and his zeal, his faith, really touched key people. And the legacy, as I mentioned earlier, that legacy of moving through building this kingdom of God through this great lens of theology of the body, this great lens of this personal connection that you saw so intimately in the photo, in the film, and some of the great themes from his life. But we want to introduce our panelists tonight, and our goal really is to draw parallels, as I said, from Cardinal George's life, his ethos, back to those teachings of the theology of the body, and his legacy with the Chastity Education Initiative. Of course, we're hoping to touch your hearts, our supporters, and to inspire you with this evening, with this conversation, and hope you'll be moved to support the Chastity Education Initiative in such great work. So let's move to our panel. My pleasure to introduce, for many of you who know, Father Daniel FLENS. Father Daniel is a Chicago homegrown priest. He's part of the Archdiocese seminary system from high school through major seminary when he was ordained a priest on May 20th, 1989 by Cardinal Bernardin after attending the seminary at St. Mary's on the Lake in Mundelein. He served in archdiocesan parishes until July of 2003. When Cardinal George asked him to become his priest secretary. You saw him throughout the film with him by his side in those great scenes and segments. He served and worked closely with Cardinal George for almost 12 years until his death in April 2015. After the Cardinal's death, he joined the formation faculty of St. Joseph College Seminary, which ended when the college was closed in the spring of 2019. Father Dan currently serves as the associate pastor of Our Lady of Ransom Church in Niles, Illinois. Father Dan, I'm so glad you're with us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Damon.
Great. Mary Louise Hengesba. Mary Louise was the Respect Life Director in Archdiocese, under the Archdiocese, under Cardinal George for more than 7 years, and founded this Chastity Education Initiative under Cardinal's direction. We're going to talk a bit about that. She left the position to be a stay-at-home mom, to start real work, as my wife would say, and now is blessed with 3 children through adoption and other miracles. She continues to be involved in the pro-life movement as chair of the Illinois Citizens for Ethics Political Action Committee and as a member of the Chastity Education Initiative Benefit Committee. Mary Louise, so good to see you and glad you're here.
Good to see you, Damon. Thank you.
Wonderful. And last but certainly not least, Bishop Robert Barron, founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries and auxiliary bishop, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. He's also the host of Catholicism, a groundbreaking, award-winning documentary about the Catholic faith, which aired on PBS. Bishop Barron is a #1 Amazon best-selling author and has published numerous books, essays, and articles on theology and spiritual life. He's a religious correspondent for NBC and also appeared on Fox News, CNN, and EWTN. Bishop Barron's website, wordonfire.org, reaches millions of people each year, and he is one of the most followed Catholics on social media. His regular YouTube videos have been viewed by over 50 million people, and he's over 3 million followers on his Facebook page. He's been invited to speak about religion at the headquarters of Facebook, Google, and Amazon. That's another great segment, Word on Fire, many of us have enjoyed. And he's keynoted many conferences and events all over the world, including World Youth Day in Krakow, the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia, my hometown here, and which Pope Francis marked a historic visit here to the United States. He shared dialogue with Dr. Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro, William Lane Craig, among other influencers and thought leaders. Bishop Barron's recent series, Catholicism, The Pivotal Players, has been syndicated for national television and nominated for an Emmy Award. His most recent project is the Word on Fire Institute, a new hub for spiritual and intellectual formation, training members of the Word on Fire movement to proclaim Christ in the culture. Bishop Barron, thank you so much for being with us.
It's my great pleasure. Good to see everybody.
Yes, wonderful. I think we have a real special opportunity in the panel here with each of this ethos that we saw through even that segment of the film of things that really moved Cardinal George and the way that he activated and drew people in to what's now a real legacy. One particular element was how he made his mission to evangelize the culture. That was a great scene in that movie, a great recalling of John Paul II asking him, "What are you going to do to evangelize the culture?" And then he dedicated and delegated beautiful people like our panelists here, church leaders, to do this. So maybe we start there. Maybe it's just a personal reflection, Bishop Barron, on that movement that you alluded to and shared a little bit in the film of that connection.
Yeah, I think Cardinal George saw so clearly that the faith has a public dimension. And he said that over and over again. It's not simply a matter of my private convictions or something that we whisper among ourselves, but the Christian faith is meant to be a public reality. And that meant influencing the different features of the culture. An image that he liked was in the book of Revelation, the heavenly Jerusalem, so the fulfillment of all things, this great city comes down from heaven. And there's no temple in it. You say, well, why wouldn't there be a temple in the perfect city? Well, it's because the whole city's become a temple, right? The whole city. Think of now, finance and business and sports and education and all the things that make up a city all turn toward the Lord. They become a place of right praise. And I think that's what he meant by a public Christianity and one that has evangelized the culture. So yes, we evangelize individuals, obviously, but we also reach out to the institutions of the culture to try to get them in touch with the Lord. And he felt so strongly about that. And yes, indeed, he did turn to me on several occasions and say, that's what I see for Word on Fire, is that kind of engagement.
And in that sense, you felt, it sounds like here and in the movie, that encouragement really was that step forward, because you could have been doing work in different forums and different ways of educating, but would you describe that push from Cardinal George as really the formation of a real organized effort?
He's the grandfather of Word on Fire. If I'm the father of it, he's the grandfather of it. He took me aside one night at the seminary. I was just back from a trip. I've been speaking somewhere. I came back and he was there at a public function and he said, I want to talk to you, which is always a little bit unnerving. And he said, I want you to evangelize the culture. And I said to him, well, what does that mean exactly? And he said, well, I don't know, but I want you to do it. So that was the beginning of our long conversation, I would say, around that issue. And then that's when he shared the John Paul II story with me that I shared during the film.
Beautiful. And Mary Louise, I see you nodding your head there. And was there something similar with that conversation regarding Respect Life and the Chastity Education Initiative that we are celebrating tonight? Tell a little bit more about your origin story with Cardinal George.
Oh, absolutely. I met him actually at a young adult ministry event, a Theology on Tap event, and I had told him about a book I'd written about chastity for teens, and so he said, oh, let me take a look at it. And then he wrote an endorsement for it, which was so nice. And he said to me, we need this in our schools. And I'm like, okay, well, you guys can have me in part-time sometimes to, go speak. He's like, no, part-time. Do you know how many schools we have? We need a program for this. We need to reach all of the schools. And of course, we don't have any money, so you have to raise money for it. And I was like, this sounds exciting. And so when I became Respect Life director, he said, this is what I really want you to focus on. And he was right. There was a huge demand for it. And I was getting discouraged, actually, because there was so much demand. And it was one thing that it was kind of the hand of the Holy Spirit that there was a priest who had passed away, and he left his life insurance to the Respect Life office. And that became the beginning of the program. That, and then a very generous donor stepped forward and gave a check, and I was really burnt out. I had been doing about 40 chastity talks per month, and this was in addition to all the other Respect Life director work, which I think I was partially neglecting, to tell you the truth, because there was so much demand. And that was in the beginning of the Chastity Education Initiative. We could hire a young person in to dedicate full time to going to the schools and parishes. But there have been so many young people touched through that program, and it was really his vision at the beginning that, no, we need this. We need a big program that reaches our parish religious education programs in our schools.
Yeah, in the early days, though, Mary Louise, was the drive really just to give information? There must have been some heart drive that moved to to open up the schools and to put your voice in there. It had to be more than just information. Is that right?
Oh yeah. Well, this had been. I mean, I'm just a has-been now, but I was Miss Wisconsin in 1999, and my platform was abstinence until marriage. And so, so I spoke that year to over 100,000 teens in 20-some states. I can't remember how many now. I mean, this is over 20 years ago. Come on.
Yeah, it's a lot. It was a lot.
But anyway, so it was really exciting, and it was just really important to me because I saw, first of all, the benefit in my own life. And the beauty of that choice in my own life, but also a close friend of mine became pregnant as a teen and became a teen. She decided to parent that child, and I saw how difficult that was for her. And another friend of mine in college had an abortion, and I saw how devastating that was in her life. That really opened my eyes, actually, because I had been pro-choice, and then I realized abortion really hurts women, actually. And so that was a big part of my conversion as well.
And having worked in diocese for many years, I know that kind of support from your Archbishop, Bishop, Cardinal is just pivotal, not only when you get those downtimes, but also in the courage to form and to step out and do that kind of work.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was always very encouraging to me, and even when things were difficult. And sometimes, I would make mistakes. When I started working for him, I was still in my 20s, and I would sometimes be overly bold or getting out there. And he always backed me up. Father Dan can kind of maybe attest to, maybe I caused some problems sometimes because I would be filled with zeal, But he was always so encouraging, and he just was an incredible man.
Yeah, that's a great segue, Father Dan. You were as the pre-secretary. First of all, what was it like to get that call to be pre-secretary? I mean, it's similar but different in most dioceses to get that proximity to the, the bishop and the drama that's there. You had to have seen sort of the way that he moved in and out, and that ethos we're talking about that came from his heart, came from his deep being to delegate to these issues. What struck you watching the film tonight and thinking about this legacy?
Well, to what you're discussing now about evangelizing the culture, Cardinal George could certainly, and many times did, understand this and speak about it according to the big picture. He gave countless talks on the intersection of faith and culture. He edited articles on evangelization and wrote them. But it took on a personal dimension for him, I think, in getting out there, as he so often did, day after day, Sunday after Sunday, in the parishes, celebrating Mass, being with the people, going to World Youth Days and being with young people. So they didn't feel that the church was some aloof body teaching them what they should and shouldn't do. But no, I like the Archbishop. I feel close to him. And so I'm willing to listen to him and hear what he says and hear what the church has to teach me.
Yeah, I was actually struck in that part of the movie, the film, where you had the testimony at a very personal level, like you were just talking about, but then also other bishops who would stop and listen when he was speaking, on a particular issue, whether he'd written the notes right before or whether he, was really trying to influence a particular decision. That's a gift.
It is really a gift.
Charism.
As Bishop PAPROCKI said, and Bishop Barron had seen, his writing wasn't always the clearest. There were several of us on the staff whose auxiliary function was to be translators. In other words, people would come to us and say, "What did the Cardinal write there?" And a few of us got pretty adept at figuring it out.
I was also moved by his just the personal connection with Pope John Paul II, which in my faith life, one of my heroes, and of course, all the study in these decades with the theology of the body. So that connection, I think, has always been my connection with the Archdiocese and the Chastity Education Initiative for these years. But I guess most pointedly to the question of abortion and the direct killing, Cardinal George said that God never permits the killing of an innocent person, that if you can solve a personal problem by killing someone who's unborn, you can solve a personal problem by killing someone who is born. Love that. But he also spoke about destroying our constitutional order when our legal system that's sworn to protect the life of every citizen is legitimized in the killing of unborn. Bishop Barron, could you unpack this a little bit and maybe get Mary Louise as well to comment on this commitment to protecting life?
Well, he had enormous moral clarity. That was obvious from the time he arrived in Chicago. And I'll speak kind of generally here, but in the years after the council, there was a tendency to drift a bit, both intellectually and morally. We weren't quite sure, and well, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and lines got blurred and ideas got confused. And then the Cardinal came in, and I know for some of the priests, I think it was a bit off-putting at first because he was so blunt and clear. But I found it to be like a freshening breeze. He came in with such articulate clarity about moral and intellectual issues that it cleared away a lot of the fog and gave people a sense of, yeah, that's the right thing. He knew the distinction between what was morally fundamental. So we call them, intrinsically evil acts in the Catholic moral tradition, certain things that you can never justify, certain things are simply bad in themselves. And he knew what those were and how to talk about them. And I think it was bracing. It brought a clarity and therefore a purpose to a lot of people in the church who I think were adrift a bit when he arrived. So to me, that was a great gift that he gave. And then furthermore, to speak those truths, not just to the church, but to speak them to the wider society. And that's where your comment about abortion and in the public legal conversation. Well, yeah, the church belongs there because we speak an articulate language of moral philosophy. And so it's not simply something we whisper among ourselves, but we can preach that from the housetops in the wider society. He knew that too. And he was always resistant to the state's tendency toward a kind of totalitarianism, that the state now would monitor the whole of life. He was always standing athwart that. And the church plays a key role in limiting the aggressive tendencies of a totalitarian secular society. Maybe that's, one of his greatest legacies, I think, is articulating the church's role in that public give and take. And he didn't want the church to be marginalized and thereby to allow the secular society to become too dominant.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that because that really was something that struck me for the years in listening to him, is that you had this sense that unlike others in the public square who would look at our Catholic faith through a political lens, right? He really looked at politics through a Catholic lens, right? There was a clarity that there was a right order with that. And even Mary Louise, as director of the Respect Life office in those early years, you had that connection then in building the Chastity Education Initiative. Clearly you had the missio to go from Cardinal George. Did that play a role in the formation of what we now know as the Chastity Education Initiative?
Oh, absolutely. He never wanted us to in any way water anything down. It was the teachings of John Paul II on the theology of the body that is the bedrock of the Chastity Education Initiative, even to this day, 17 years after it began. But he also, he understood so well what it was to respect life, womb to tomb, and how to articulate that. And he did not shy away from doing that ever. And there were times when, I would disagree with other staff members on, he'd be appearing at an event with a politician, for example, who was pro-abortion, and he was going to speak at this event, the politician, and I would talk to my boss and, whatever. I'd talk to the office that was organizing it. Well, and then I would talk to Cardinal George, and Cardinal George would say, that's right, we said we weren't going to do that at the USCCB. And he would talk to the politician about it. He wouldn't just say, I'm not coming. But he handled it so well. He was just a great man because he understood how to speak to people where they're at. And we have to do that today. And the Chastity Education Initiative does that. Many of the young people that the CEI serves actually have been sexually active outside of marriage. And so addressing that, you can reclaim your chastity, you can reclaim purity. God still loves you. Your sexuality is a precious gift. That is just an incredible message. They may not hear that anywhere else outside of this program. And so it's just a huge blessing to get to continue to support that today and tonight with this program, actually.
Yeah, and I think we have to consider that part of the legacy as well. It's not just the ethic or the, the activity, but really that ethos that the theology of the body provides, the why behind the what. And he also spoke a lot, Cardinal George, about modernity and the focus on self, individual freedom, and how the current world has removed God from the public square, the difference between freedom of religion and freedom of worship. We heard a little bit about that in the film. Perhaps Bishop Barron, you could address this from a philosophical perspective. Is that too big a chunk to make to the world and addressing, or is it the elephant that we're supposed to be dissecting?
No, it's to that point I was making earlier about the public-private. So he didn't want religion to be construed simply as a private matter. It is that indeed, but he thought the secular state wanted to keep us in that very narrow space. But it belongs in the public place. And I love how he put it in the film that, yes, we worship God, but that leads us to the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Now, broaden that out to the whole, active life of the church in the world. And he feared that the secular state was trying to limit that and just kind of keep us sequestered in our little private space. It finally has to do with God. Now, keep in mind, the Cardinal was a philosopher, and he was very attuned to the philosophy of God. God is not one being among many, but in our great tradition, God is ipsum esse. God is the sheer act of to be itself. That's why we call him creator. He's the one that grounds and creates all things. Well, what that means is God is implicated in all things. You can't say it's like just me and my privacy with God. God has to do with everything. Now, there's the heavenly Jerusalem again. The whole city has become a place of right praise. He knew that truth in his bones, and he wanted to keep fighting for it. Now, he's a John Paul II man. We don't impose, we propose. So, he was well aware of some of the shadowy side, let's say, of religious people trying to use the secular arm to impose religion. He, of course, knew that was wrong. But by the same token, was wrong for the secular state simply to press us out of the public conversation. And that's, again, it was a principal concern of his, I think, all his career.
I hear another principle in there, John Paul II, about the person in actu, right? So engaging people to delegate like yourself, and Chastity Education Initiative is not just waiting for the kingdom of God, but becoming who we are, becoming what we are through these human acts.
Yeah, quite right. That's John Paul II's idea, that I perform or give an act, but at the same time, I'm also creating myself in a way. I'm creating the person I'm becoming. And he bought into that moral philosophy of John Paul, I think, very deeply. So that's character formation. That's virtue formation. And, Pope Francis was very good on that in Amoris Laetitia. I think something that very much overlooked in that encyclical was his chapter on virtue formation, which was very much a John Paul II and Cardinal George type emphasis.
Yeah. And Father Dan, we know, as we said, Cardinal George loved John Paul II as a mentor and as a friend. He made him a bishop. He was his pastor. How would you describe the way John Paul II's pontificate shaped Cardinal George's legacy?
I believe John Paul II, first of all, Cardinal George really felt there was his spiritual father, as I mentioned in the video. So I think Cardinal George tried to emulate that in the way he related to his priests and to the people of the diocese. Second, I think Cardinal George certainly was one who understood John Paul's thought very well and tried to carry that through in his own teaching. And then he saw how John Paul traveled the world and how the crowds reacted to the presence of the Holy Father coming to them. And even how John Paul would invite people in for Mass and would go celebrate Masses in the parishes of Rome. So I think as Cardinal George pastored this archdiocese, he would go out, he would celebrate Mass in the parishes, he would have people in for Mass, and he would get out there to those big international events because that's what his mentor did, and he saw the impact that it had on people.
That personalism in action, if you will, right? Of connecting, not just in ideas, but in a very human way.
Well, so often today when evangelization is spoken of, they always speak of the importance of that personal invitation to, and Cardinal George wanted to extend that as much as he could by having those moments where you could be one-on-one with people, the people of a parish, or at a World Youth Day, or in a college classroom, or in a jail or a hospital.
I'm thinking too, Mary Louise, about the decision to go into the schools with this, as opposed to, writing something or sending a video, or, the heart of the Chastity Education Initiative is that personal encounter, whether it's, speakers coming in, myself, or the more day-to-day work in the diocese there. That probably has a role too in the decision to make that a personal apostolate.
Absolutely. Cardinal George was always, seeking that personal connection and trying to find the right person to bring the message. So we brought in a lot of great speakers, you, Jason Everett, many others. And it would be amazing to see after the presentations, the teams lining up to speak to me or Jason or you or whomever, but, wanting to share their heart and what had happened in their lives and how much this talk meant to them and how can they change to go forward if they need to change, or just, how this affirmed what they knew in their heart was right, so that personal story is so important for the young people. That's what the Chastity Ed Initiative does now today. We have Ray Pingoy, who goes into the schools all the time, and he just does incredible work. He's known, around the diocese, and he's just incredible. So, but yeah, that carries on again, that legacy of relationship that Cardinal George had.
Yeah, and how that relationship becomes the means then to teach. It becomes the encounter in order to get to, the what's, or even the ethic, or the commandments, the laws. It really is that relational piece. Cardinal George also said that the Lord prepares us for death by stripping away our desires. That was something that struck me. And by stripping away all of our desires, all that's left is the love of God. And he spoke about redemptive suffering, shedding pride, and redemptive suffering. Michael Heinlein, the biographer, suggested that Cardinal would have seen his polio as a gift that brought him closer to God. Father Dan, you'd be a good one to address this based on your many years serving him as personal secretary. Could you elaborate on that, on sort of his stoic, if you will, I hope not fully stoic, but stoic approach to life and suffering, and how his own personal physical sufferings manifested in a real compassion that people witnessed to in the film?
Certainly. I think stoic may be too strong of a word. He definitely felt his suffering, and it wasn't as if he was sort of removed from it, but he wasn't going to let that hold him back. He integrated that into his ministry. I remember after his first bout with cancer, he talked to people about afterward how it was, he found out how sickness made it very hard to pray, and how he more than ever then was grateful for the prayers of others and really felt what it was like to be prayed for by others and to experience their kindness. At the same time, as Michael pointed out in the video, the Cardinal was always one who said, don't feel sorry for yourself. Not that you don't feel badly about the fact that you're ill, but he said, if you feel sorry for yourself, you become a victim. You sort of get trapped in that, oh, woe is me attitude, as opposed to, okay, I have this, but I'm going to get out there and do what I can, even in the midst of this suffering. I'm going to carry this cross, not stand still with the cross.
Beautiful.
So
yeah, if I could just jump in.
Would like to get out there. Go ahead, Bishop.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan, for that. And of course, I had the privilege of living at the Cardinal's house, at least part-time, for about 6 or 7 years, and knew Father Dan very well there, and didn't see the Cardinals closely as Father Dan did, but I did see, the suffering that he bore. It was not a slight problem. You know what I'm saying? That is the polio affected him in a very deep way. But I never once ever heard him complain about it. And what Father Dan said, I think, is really right. It never held him back. He just got on with it. And I think, yes, he would have seen it as a grace, as a gift from God. I remember I was there one night at the table. The Cardinal wasn't there. He was away somewhere, but I was there for dinner. And a replacement of the brace came, and one of the sisters had gotten it at the door, and she actually brought it in. And I think I was just there alone. I, of course, had never seen the brace that he wore, except maybe a little tiny bit of it. Well, this extraordinary contract he wore for much of his life. And it really struck me like, oh my goodness. But never once did I hear him complain about it. I told that story in the film about the one time I saw him really take a bad fall. I'm sure, Dan, you probably saw a few more cases of that, and got right up, got right on with it, and did not want, don't fuss over me, don't feel sorry, get on with it. He had a missionary's sensibilities. I think his OMI identity, Oblate of Mary Immaculate, was so key. I used to say to people, if you wanted to get the Cardinal talking at the table, all you had to do is say OMI, because you get 2 hours of stories because he was shaped as a missionary, and that was his consciousness. That's why the new evangelization of John Paul, I think, was so powerful for him. And missionaries don't complain that they're in difficult situations all over the world. He knew his brothers all over the world who were suffering, so he didn't complain about his polio. Just get on with the mission. I found that very moving and very spiritually uplifting to see that up close.
Beautiful. A lot of empathy, actually, too, Damon, if you don't mind me jumping in. But I remember when you were in Ukraine, and we had just gotten off the plane. Father Dan, I don't know if you remember this, but we were meeting with survivors of the Gulag, and there was a woman who had brought the sacred vessels, like she would smuggle them for underground masses. And there was a man who was a priest, and he had been imprisoned for celebrating mass underground. And so, he'd been imprisoned for years, and they were sharing their story. And I am so tired. It has got to be 4:30 in the morning, and I'm just exhausted because we had just gotten off the plane, several connections to get into Ukraine. And Cardinal George is just entering into and empathizing with the suffering of these heroes as they're sharing about, what they had to do in order to live their Catholic faith, under communism. It's just, he was just truly entering in. I was like, this is amazing, but I really need sleep. But this is incredible. He's decades older than I am. How does he have all this energy? But he's just energized by the suffering of other people and the incredible empathy that he had for that and compassion.
The other place you really saw that was when he went to Lourdes a couple times. That was his favorite Marian shrine, because he said there the sick are at the center of things. And he not only enjoyed being there and leading prayer, but also just, I think Father Bema at Mundelein has a great picture of him with someone who had just come out of the baths, and they just wanted a blessing. And he just felt, I'm among my own people now, in a sense. They have their chronic illnesses, I have mine, and we're here together.
Yeah, that's a great segue to what I'd like to move to, his devotion to the priesthood, both his own commitment to being pastor, bishop, priest over everything else. I mean, that came through in the film, and I think I hear that even in the commentary that you all are offering here, and his devotion to all of his priests. Probably, maybe you could speak a little bit more there about this lived devotion to the priesthood, his own and to those he was given shepherd over.
Well, as Bishop Barron mentioned in the video, at the center of each day was celebrating Mass, whether it was starting the day with Mass in his chapel at the residence or celebrating Mass publicly somewhere. So the Eucharist was at the center of things, and therefore the priesthood was at the center of his day-to-day life. He really saw himself, and he wanted his auxiliary bishops to be pastors to the priest. He saw that sort of father-son relationship. He said, a priest is not my employee. It's more, he's a member of the family. And that's why he always made time for priests. And Bishop Barron is absolutely correct when he said, the Cardinal said, if the priest calls for an appointment, you find the first available slot and get him in here to see me. I don't care if it's my day off, if it's Sunday night or something. If it's really urgent, get him in here. And that was extended not only to the priests, but to the seminarians. He would love going up there. He would love having dinners, especially with the Chicago guys. He would love doing Q&A with the seminary community. And in particular, what struck me is I remember when the seminarians would start calling me to say, I would like to make an appointment to talk to the cardinal about something. That was a shocker, because in my day, if you were asked to go make an appointment with the archbishop, that probably meant you should be packing your bags and taking them with you. And these were guys who were calling and saying, no, I want to come and I want to talk to the cardinal, and they would come in and have a wonderful conversation and go back to the seminary.
Wow.
So he really made time for them.
Yeah, Bishop Bear, I see you smiling there. You got a thought there on that image of the love of his fatherhood, priesthood.
Yeah, and I saw when I was rector of the seminary course, his great devotion to that place, to Mundelein, and to the students there. I'm also smiling because now that I'm not an ordinary of a diocese, but auxiliary bishop in charge of a region out here in the LA Archdiocese, Cardinal George's devotion to priests got very deep into me because I saw it close up. And actually, Pope Francis, at our last ad limina visit in Rome, the California bishops went there just before the COVID thing happened. So we were with him. He said, if a priest calls you, I want you to make sure you get back to him within 24 hours. The Pope said that. And when he said that, I thought, it's Cardinal George. That's exactly what Cardinal George did. So I've tried now on a much smaller scale, out here, but anytime a priest of my region calls me, I get immediately back. I immediately set up an appointment because of what Father Dan said. It's not an employee. This is a brother. And the ministry of the bishop to priests, right, he took that as really fundamental. He was a priest, Cardinal George. Loved being a priest, admired priests, understood the centrality of the priesthood. I think I said that in the film, but he was a man of the Eucharist. I mean, a man of the Mass. And I love Cardinal George never said Mass in a flashy way. It was kind of a, get to it sort of manner.
Follow the rubric.
But, yeah, but you always knew he was someone who was deeply devoted to what he was doing, and it was the center of his life, the source and summit, as Vatican II said.
The beautiful part about that, both of your comments about his devotion is it skips right over any kind of clericalism, any kind of sort of a higher. It is a devotion that doesn't align itself. And I think, Mary Louise, you can talk to how, the way that he reached out to you and the way he encouraged and engaged you was no form of any sort of a clericalism, but very much a devotion of his priesthood to serve not just a topic, but people.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, as a woman working for him, was a blessing because he didn't have any issues with, he just had great respect for the dignity of women and understood how to relate. And sometimes, it's hard actually working in the church as a woman because, you're surrounded by men and there is a difference there. And, I would say a substantial one. So anyway, and so he understood though, and just related very well and was, very encouraging always. And he put women in many leadership roles, as you saw in the film. And there were even more women in the film that, people like Mary Helen Fiorito and others who had very influential roles in the Archdiocese of Chicago. And so he was a pioneer in that way, but wasn't anything that was put on for show. It was just, that was who he was.
Well, that's beautiful. We have some questions from Facebook here. I'm going to start with a question from John Green. And he's curious what you all, panel, would think Cardinal George would say to our current world situation, particularly racial conflict, the pandemic, the political division, churches struggling, et cetera, et cetera. What words of wisdom would the Cardinal speak in our time?
That's quite a broad range of topics there.
It is. It is. I think it's centered on the Cardinal as opposed to, bumper stickers here on topics.
Yeah, I found myself thinking about that just in light of what's been happening in the city of Chicago here recently with some of the rioting and looting and all that, and even some of the ongoing gun violence. And the Cardinal is part of efforts to address that. But I think he would say this is what happens to a culture when we begin to treat human life so cheaply. that if you can destroy the most innocent of human lives in the mother's womb, and people get formed by that idea, then what's to stop the gangbanger from spraying a crowd and taking out a 5-year-old watching TV?
Mm-hmm. And, you know, he actually kind of prophesied this, because he said he would die in his bed and then his successor would die in jail. And, you know, we saw even with Cardinal Pell kind of this kind of strangulation of truth by those who are, you know, just have issues with the truth of the church. And so there is persecution, even that we were non-essential. You know, faith, food for the soul is as important as food for the body, and yet how could it be non-essential? I think he would have taken an issue with that, but I think he foresaw this. I don't know, Bishop Barron, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good, you know, provocative question, because a lot goes through your mind. One thing, you know, he was very passionate about racial justice issues, and I think he would have seen the centrality of, you know, rectifying that situation within our society. At the same time, I think he'd be appalled by some of the attacks on religion, which are very much, I'd say, rampant in our society now. Out here in California, we have the statue wars over Junipero Serra, et cetera. But what I've noticed is the rather, you know, blatant anti-Catholicism behind some of this. You see it in ways both subtle and not so subtle, the way the society is pillaring religion. And he was very sensitive to that, and I think correctly prophesied a lot of things that are present in our culture now. He'd be an articulate voice fighting against that marginalization, or at the limit, persecution of religion. At the same time, great prophet, it seems to me, of racial justice in our country. So again, the public voice of the church, I think he would be that public voice very much in the present circumstance.
And he wrote a pastoral letter actually on systemic, and that was a major part of his
Father Dan, any comments on that, on sort of the what ifs, the provocative question of his being here to speak to our age right now?
Oh, I think what I could say has been said, that he definitely would have kind of pulled it all together, because he had the philosophical vision to say, here's what I think is at the root of a lot of these issues, and here's how we can bring them all together, and or not bring them together, but here's how we can address them.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful. Maybe change gears a little bit and prick your memories personally about encounters with the Cardinal, and if there are any words of wisdom the Cardinal shared with you, anything, sometimes even the public ones, you feel like they're speaking right to us when we hear them. But maybe any comments that you might remember now, and sort of remembering the legacy of Cardinal George that moved you, that formed you, that you can recall for us.
I'll give you one. This was, I won't name who this person was, but there was a kind of a prominent Catholic public figure who had sort of a fall from grace. This was many years ago. And when that became public, that very day I came back to the house. I remember I was coming up the stairs in the residence, and the Cardinal was coming down the stairs. And he looked at me and he said, "Okay, you're not a guru, you're a Catholic priest." And I said, "Pardon me?" He said, "You're not a guru, you're a Catholic priest." And what he meant was, don't fall into the trap of becoming a sort of, center of a cult of personality. Whatever you're doing it as a Catholic priest, as a representative of the church. And I must say that echoes in my mind as I continue doing this work of, public evangelization and using the media. You're not a guru, so don't think it's about you and your personality. It's about the church. And it was typical Cardinal George, blunt, a little bit funny, a little edgy, in your face, but making a clear point. That stays in my mind.
That's great. Father Daniel, anything strike you as still impactful in your life right now?
Well, I remember him saying on a number of occasions to seminarians and to newly ordained priests, he said, he would talk about the experience of religious orders and even some of the great missionaries who would go out and sometimes know that they were kissing their parents goodbye for the last time when they went off to some country, or they would probably die of disease or persecution. he would say, for a diocesan priest, your ascesis is availability. With it, what you need, what you do, you sacrifice yourself in making yourself available to your people. And that's what he did time after time again. And I always try to remember that when I think, well, should I make time for this person today or put them off for a few more days? It's like that little voice comes back. No, if you got the time, take care of it now.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Mary Louise, what crossed your heart and mind?
Well, you know, it's interesting. The women of the Respect Life office have always had sad stories about fertility, actually. And so you knew about when I was Respect Life Tractor, I had infertility and for many years. And then I had a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. I was actually driving to a Chastity presentation in Western Springs, and I was like in a lot of pain, and it was, you know, and everything. And then after that, the infertility was even worse. Actually, I've had a miracle since then, which occurred after Cardinal George's death, because I have a biological child, which is such a blessing here on earth, as well as 2 incredible adopted children. But he always said, you know, that suffering is not in vain. You know, that God hears and knows about your sadness. And it's not just me, but another woman in the Respect Life office, my predecessor, even others who have worked for Cardinal George as well. There's sort of a group of us who had this great sadness, and they always said, you know, God knows and God hears your cry and, you know, holds you, you know, so don't ever feel like it's for nothing. You know, you can always, you know, use that suffering for your work for life, you know, that it's sort of very closely tied in, you know, in a sense, you know, respect for life and then a longing for life, you know, that is unrequited. So that has inspired me and continues to, you know, and I do believe that our child, you know, was an answer, you know, from his intercession, and it's just such a blessing. So, but I have 3 little ones in heaven, and, you know, that's so painful in a way, but in another way, you know, to know that they're with God, and, you know, I just know that suffering is not in vain, you know, as he had said to me. So.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. You know, almost next sort of question topic is meant to be very respectful, but, you know, when you have an office and you've got responsibilities, but you're also a man of that office, you know, there are times when, you know, you get a chance to see, you know, the human, you mentioned some empathy earlier, Father Dan, you get to see the man. I'm curious if you could share any stories, any of you, about the times where you really saw the man, again, I mean that respectfully, knowing that the office is of paramount here. But what could you share a little bit about the man, Cardinal George, that really struck you and still strikes you today when you think about him?
Well, someone who didn't hesitate to share bits of his childhood with people, and that's what endeared him too. He would talk about going to ball games. He still loved going to a ball game or two when he could find time once or so he could talk with people about that, and men could relate and women could relate to that sort of experience. He would talk about being a child in Chicago and going trick-or-treating on Halloween, and not just getting the candy, but sometimes he says, oh, we played a few tricks on people who wouldn't give us the candy. And he would describe those. And he could be a bit of a little terror at times, the way he related it. So there were some of those funny moments that he would share. And there were days where privately or in the car or something, he'd be reading his mail or he'd get a phone call, and he could be very frustrated at someone or something. And but he knew that it wasn't going to go any further than that space we were in, and so he would do his work.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful.
Father Dan, I'm sure you remember when he first came to Chicago, the first talk he gave to all the priests, and he said a little bit about himself. Then he said, that's the last time you're going to hear from me from this pulpit. This pulpit is to talk about Jesus Christ. And it was kind of bracing because, you know, our generation was very much formed, and when you preach, you should talk a lot about yourself, about your experience. And I found that very, again, like a breath of fresh air. Was kind of bracing, like, yeah, the pulpit is not for me to talk about myself. Now, having said that, you did see the humanity of Cardinal George all the time. One of my great memories, I mentioned in the film, how funny he was.
Yes.
I remember, you know, the dear sisters in the house, these wonderful Polish sisters that took care of the house. And they used to tell me that when I'd come to the dinner, especially, they were struck by how much we laughed. And we talked about serious things. As I mentioned, I like to bring up ideas and books, and he loved talking about Heidegger and Husserl and, you know, Kant and all this. But he was funny, and he was funny in a kind of edgy, a little bit sarcastic, loved to kind of needle. I remember once at the table being with his family. A lot of his cousins were all there.
Oh, yeah.
And I saw, that's where he got it from. They were all the same, all this kind of needling and, you know, good humor. But he loved to laugh. And we would just roar with laughter about, you know, everything. So that was, I think, maybe underappreciated in Cardinal George, what a lot of fun he was, and funny. Like a lot of smart people, he was very funny.
Yeah, as you remember, they would come to celebrate his birthday every year in January, and that's when he would have the back and forth with his cousins and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to bring my oldest son one time. He was my only child at the time when he was like 1 year old, to a meeting. And it was actually a really important meeting with Cardinal George and the Vicar General, and couldn't find a sitter. So I just brought my 1 year old, and Cardinal George sees him, and Cardinal George had baptized him. And when he saw Ben, he's like, I love this guy's haircut. It's just like mine, because he was bald. I remember too, when I was in the hospital, when I came home after the ruptured ectopic pregnancy, Brian's like, you have to hear this voicemail. And it was from Cardinal George. And he says, Brian, it's Cardinal. You said that you were going to update me. You haven't called me. Please call me. I was like kind of peeved, you know, but he's like, hey, you know, you didn't tell me. But he was hilarious. He was, and it's always, you know, thinking of others always, and never himself. But yeah, he was always coming up with those one-liners all the time. It's just really funny.
Oh, that's great. We are coming toward our end here. I wanted maybe to project a little bit and just ask, how can we not just celebrate but carry on his legacy? You know, what are some of the real specific things, not in a, you know, a romantic way, but in a very concrete way, that the work, obviously, Word on Fire, and we'll talk more about the Chastity Ed initiative, but just some thoughts about how we can celebrate by carrying on his legacy.
Bring the church out into the public square. Don't be afraid of that. Announce the faith publicly to the culture, not imposing, but proposing with confidence and with panache and with intelligence. I think would be a Cardinal George legacy. Don't privatize the faith. Don't buy into that etiquette of our time, but rather boldly, publicly, non-violently, but confidently propose the faith in the public square. To me, that's the best way to honor his legacy.
Wow. I love that. And I just said, just to follow up with that, is that beyond even just sort of that cultural block of privatizing religion, there's also a tone as well, right? And the way that we engage. And I'm wondering if that also is the legacy here, that personalism that speaks to, first of all, founded on the dignity of the human person revealed through Jesus Christ. But I'm struck by the lens of the age now where, you know, again, we view our faith through a political lens as opposed to our politics through a faith lens. So would you add to that also the way that we engage as part of that legacy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say the Cardinal George combination of high intelligence, but with a personal engagement, that's a good combination. He learned that from John Paul II. He embodied that. I learned that from him. I mean, so as I'm trying to do this work, I think of him all the time. And I think you're right. Just that combination of not just what you're doing, but how you're doing it. Smartly, so not in a, you know, hand-wringing apologetic way, but also not aggressively, but engaging people where they are. I learned all that at his feet, so to speak. I think he learned it at the feet of John Paul II.
Beautiful. And Father Dan, right in the Archdiocese there, Chicago, as a priest, how would you describe a way to carry that legacy on as an honor?
Well, thank you. I would add that the Cardinal believed that one of the principal ways the Church, as he would put it, introduced people to Christ and taught them who Christ is, was through her liturgy, and to celebrate the Mass and the sacraments, not in a cold way, but reverently and beautifully, was a way of teaching people about Christ and drawing them into his body, the Church. And that's why he was even so passionate about the translation efforts he was involved in producing the current Roman Missal we have, and about seeing that when he would go out to parishes, the liturgy was celebrated well, because he cared about that. That was a principal outreach, a principal means of evangelization. He was, I think, of Benedict's mind in that sense, that if we get the liturgy right, a lot of other things flow from that and will go correctly.
Beautiful. And Mary Louise, as we pivot to the other element of our evening tonight, the Catholic Education Initiative and support for that work, how would you describe, as Dawn's work as the new director and your legacy through, or Cardinal's legacy through you to that? How would you describe that honoring and celebration in the legacy of the Chastity Ed Initiative?
Well, this ministry was very important to Cardinal George, and it was it's a great legacy of his that is touching the lives of thousands of young people every year. You look at ECHO retreats, for example, for college students and teens, and we've had vocations to the priesthood coming out of these ECHO retreats. You look at these wonderful chastity presentations and theology of the body curricula that are in our schools in the Archdiocese of Chicago and beyond. These things are touching young people and changing their hearts. And that wouldn't have been happening if it hadn't been Cardinal George saying, we need this in the Archdiocese of Chicago those many years ago. So by supporting the Chastity Education Initiative, people are carrying on the Cardinal's legacy and really changing lives, the lives of young people who are being touched very personally by God through this call to chastity. And they may not hear that anywhere else. So it's really an important ministry to support, and it's carrying on the legacy and the vision that Cardinal George had all those years ago.
Beautiful. And as we end our panel here and really close our evening, I want to thank each of you, Bishop Barron, Father Dan, Mary Louise, for sharing your heart, your experience with Cardinal George as we honor him, and in particular him through the legacy of the Chastity Education Initiative. Any final comments from any of you or each of you before we close tonight? Maybe stirred up something in your heart and memory you want to share and leave with us.
Just grateful for the opportunity, and maybe Father Dan mentioned this, but I pray to Cardinal George a lot. I ask for his intercession pretty much every morning in my chapel during my holy hour. So I think of him as a heavenly friend to me personally, and also to my work. So I still feel connected to Cardinal George, though he's been gone now for 5 years.
Beautiful.
Just to build on that, I live not far from where he's buried, and so occasionally when I'm driving past, I'll stop in and say a prayer, much as he used to go and pray for his parents. But I will always see signs around the grave that people are visiting there, and that's why he wanted to be buried there, was he knew people would come and visit and pray for him.
Yes, and I do think his intercession is very powerful too. So I've had personal experience with that. And so I encourage everybody who's tuning in to also, think of him as a heavenly friend, as Bishop Barron said. I think that's just the right way to consider him. So
beautiful. Father Daniel FLENS, Bishop Robert Barron, Mary Louise, thank you all for your testimony tonight and your presence and your time. And for all of you watching who have, by watching this and participated tonight, really are counted among the family and the supporters of the Chastity Education Initiative. I hope our longtime supporters will continue to support this great work. And for folks that are new tonight, I hope you're impressed by not just the work that's being done right now in the schools in the Archdiocese and the way that we're engaging young adults throughout, but also the way that this is rooted in a deep part of the Archdiocese of Chicago in a way that provides a legacy to a man who's impacted not just the Archdiocese, but the United States and beyond with his gift, his faith, and his love in Jesus Christ. But now it's part of the evening where we need your support very specifically. Your financial support, Mary Louise mentioned from the beginning, this effort started because of the generosity of one or two very key people to make this happen. We're well beyond that now with hundreds of you that make this work possible. And your donations, which can be made in the box, the link that's right in either Facebook or YouTube, depending on how you're watching, is the way that this work continues, this legacy continues, and most importantly, bringing about the kingdom and addressing what is arguably the most important challenge of our young people in understanding chastity, not as an ethic to follow, but really as an understanding of the right use of the sexual powers. I mentioned earlier that I had the privilege of speaking as part of the initiative these years, and I can tell you personally the gift of being with these young people, whether they're in the schools and just traveling around. I know personally I've worked with ECHO, Dumox Ministries down in New Orleans, and ECHO Chicago, and to be able to bring that to the diocese is beyond measure, but certainly worthy of your support. So we're going to ask you now to be generous in your financial support for this ministry. Again, if you've supported before, prayerfully consider how you can not just maintain, but really expand this great work to allow it to flourish. Just a couple of contact things. $100 would pay to send a TOB trained young adult to give a talk at a Catholic school or a parish. $600 would provide a scholarship to that ECHO experience, that intensive week of theology of the body for teens and young adults. $1,000 would provide a theology of the body curricula. Again, some of the best in the country. Ruah Wood's Rooted program, Ascension Press, Theology of the Body for Teens. Again, I've had firsthand experience that can testify to the power of these programs. $1,200 would send a staff member to take a continuing education course at the Theology of the Body Institute, where I had led for many years and have seen dioceses, I've seen organizations and marriages in particular transformed by that week-long intensive course. And bigger gifts, $10,000 would bring a dynamic national speaker to the diocese. Doesn't have to be me. There are other wonderful people, but I would be honored to come back. And that also $10,000 could also provide for a youth rally for life. That's run in conjunction with the March for Life, just a way to engage together in Chicago, the March for Life Chicago. But really, no matter what your donation is, everything helps. You know how this works. We're offering also to send a DVD of the unabridged version of tonight's video, Glorious Lives, to anyone who donates $50 or more tonight. And again, you can donate through that link in the description section of the live stream. Or if you prefer, you can call the Respect Life office and make that donation directly there. Phone number is 312-534-5355. And you can learn where you can mail your check there. But bottom line is, you are the heart of this legacy. Legacies continue based on those who join and allow it to begin generation to generation. And you've heard tonight from the movie, from the testimony of our panelists, and maybe even your own story about how Cardinal George in his faith set things in motion, how people responded to that and formed great things like Word on Fire and the Chastity Education Initiative. So you can be part of that. I just finished a wonderful book from Father Henry Nouwen, and he speaks about this gift of ministry that allows us, as we are, to take part and to contribute to building the kingdom of God on earth, and not to minimize the financial support as really enabling these to happen. So we ask you to be generous in your support for the Chastity Education Initiative. And I welcome back the current director of Dawn Fitzpatrick.
Hello, that was incredible. Wow, what a great evening. And Damon, thank you so much for leading that discussion and kind of making the whole thing flow. You did such a
lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
It was so much fun to be watching it, you know. It was great. I only knew Cardinal George for a very short time. He hired me, but he retired and then died soon after. But what a delight he was, the little bit of time I knew him. And it's so great that we're able to honor him in this way and bring some of, his key leaders together to talk about just what a wonderful man he was. And like I said,
it was so natural. It was so natural. There wasn't a, sort of a scripted thing. Here you see Bishop Barron, Father Daniel, and Mary Louise just really checking their memories of that encounter with him. So that was really a joy to see.
Absolutely. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for hanging with us for the last 2 hours. And thank you all for your support, because I feel blessed that God called me to Chicago. I moved here from South Carolina, if you can imagine, to Chicago to do this work. And it's because of all of you that we're able to do this work. So thank you so much. And thanks again. God bless you all.